Chapter 8. Continuity over intensity. Intensity is easy to romanticize because it is visible. It announces itself in late nights, decisive sprints, the sudden burst of output that makes a person feel briefly transformed. It comes with adrenaline, with urgency, with the satisfying sense that something is finally happening. In work, intensity is often praised because it resembles commitment. It looks like caring. It looks like someone who wants it badly enough. Continuity rarely looks like anything at all. Continuity is quiet. It is a person returning to the same surface day after day, sometimes with energy, sometimes without, sometimes with clean focus, sometimes with friction. It produces no dramatic story in the moment, which is why it is easy to underestimate. Yet most real progress is built in this quiet register. Skill accumulates through repeated contact. Trust accumulates through repeated follow-through. Stability accumulates through repeated decisions that are not renegotiated every time the weather changes. The mind prefers intensity because intensity feels like proof. It offers an emotional receipt. A person can point to the sensation of exertion and conclude that they are doing something meaningful. Continuity offers fewer emotional markers. It can feel almost ordinary, and because it feels ordinary, it does not always satisfy the mind's appetite for significance. A person can work steadily and still feel as though nothing is happening because the work is not accompanied by a dramatic internal tone. This is one reason why people drift toward burst patterns even when bursts cost them. A burst has a beginning that feels energizing. It creates a clear narrative. I'm back, I'm locked in, I'm finally doing it. The mind enjoys this story because it feels like renewal. It feels like identity restoration. The person becomes, for a brief window, the version of themselves they like to imagine. They can live inside that version for a night, a week, sometimes longer, and the experience can be intoxicating. Then the burst ends, as bursts do. When it ends, the contrast can feel like failure. A normal day arrives with normal friction, and the mind interprets the loss of intensity as the loss of capacity. The person concludes that something has slipped. They begin waiting for the next wave of inspiration, the next mood, the next crisis, the next deadline that will force them into motion again. In this way, intensity becomes not just an occasional tool, but a dependency. The worker becomes someone who needs an altered state to do meaningful work. That dependency is expensive because intensity is volatile. It draws from nervous system activation. It thrives on pressure. It can be fueled by fear of consequences, fear of falling behind, fear of being seen as inadequate. It can also be fueled by excitement, by novelty, by the initial glow of a new plan. These fuels burn hot, which is why intensity feels powerful. They also burn out. When they do, the worker is left not only tired, but often slightly disoriented because their sense of progress was tied to the feeling rather than to the work itself. Continuity reorients progress away from feeling and back toward contact. It does not deny that intensity can produce output. It simply refuses to treat output as the same thing as progress. Output can be flashy and still be unstable. Progress is what remains when mood is removed. It is what can be repeated. It is what continues in the middle of a normal week under imperfect conditions without needing a special emotional climate to begin. Most people, if they look closely, have experienced this difference in some form. They have had the week where they did a great deal in a short span and then spent the next week recovering, reorganizing, repairing the collateral damage caused by speed, or simply trying to regain access to their own attention. They have also had the period where they moved slowly but steadily, where nothing felt spectacular, yet the work advanced in a way that did not require recovery. The second pattern rarely feels heroic in the moment. It feels almost too modest to count, which is precisely why it is so powerful over time. Continuity does not demand emotional permission, and because it does not demand it, it becomes available more often. This availability is the core advantage. A person who relies on intensity is not always able to work when work is required. They are able to work when their internal state becomes sharp enough, urgent enough, energized enough. A person who relies on continuity can work in a wider range of climates. Their effort is not as dramatic, but it is more reliable. Reliability compounds. Compounding is an unpopular word in modern work culture because it feels slow. People want leverage, they want hacks, they want breakthroughs, they want the moment when everything shifts. Breakthroughs do happen. They are rarely the result of a single inspired night. They are usually the result of accumulated contact reaching a threshold. A person returns to the same craft for months, years, and then one day something integrates. That integration looks sudden from the outside. From the inside, it was built by continuity. Continuity is also how the mind becomes less emotional about work. Intensity amplifies emotion. It makes everything feel high stakes. It sharpens judgment. It increases the mind's tendency to interpret difficulty as threat and success as identity validation. Under intensity, the worker is more likely to react to small signals, more likely to take things personally, more likely to become attached to outcomes. This attachment can be motivating, but it is also destabilizing. It makes the worker vulnerable to any disruption in the emotional fuel that was sustaining the push. Continuity does something subtler. It lowers the dramatic temperature. When a person works in small, unbroken efforts, work becomes familiar. Familiarity is calming, not because it makes the work easy, but because it makes the work less symbolic. A task becomes less of a referendum on the self and more of a surface to be met. A difficult project becomes less of a looming unknown and more of a sequence of known contacts. Even uncertainty becomes more tolerable because uncertainty is no longer a reason to stop. It is simply a condition that remains while the next piece is built. This is why continuity often feels emotionally neutral compared to intensity. It is not that the worker feels nothing, it is that they feel less compelled by what they feel. The mind tends to resist continuity at first because continuity lacks novelty. It lacks the surge. It requires a person to accept that progress is going to be made in a way that does not always feel like progress. This acceptance can be surprisingly difficult for ambitious people because ambition often carries an image of transformation. People imagine progress as a series of peaks. Continuity feels like walking a long road with the horizon barely moving. Yet the road is what gets you there. Small, unbroken effort has another advantage that intensity lacks. It preserves calibration. When a person works steadily, they stay in contact with the true size of things. They can sense early when a plan is off, when a project is drifting, when their own capacity is being overdrawn. They can make corrections before the cost becomes high. Intensity often bypasses this calibration. It encourages oversimplification and overcommitment. The worker is moving too fast to notice the subtle signals that would prevent future pain. This is why intense bursts produce rework. They produce output, but the output is sometimes built on rushed decisions, misunderstood requirements, or emotional urgency that disguised itself as clarity. The work may look complete, but it carries hidden flaws that surface later. Continuity allows the work to be built with fewer hidden debts. It may take longer in the short term, but it costs less in the long term because it reduces the need for recovery and repair. There is also a social dimension. Intensity often creates turbulence in relationships. A person in a burst state can become less patient. They can communicate sharply. They can treat interruptions as personal attacks. They can become rigid and controlling because the burst depends on protecting a narrow tunnel of focus. Others feel this. Teams begin to work around the person's intensity rather than with them. The person may be productive, but they can become a destabilizing force, and over time, that destabilization limits what can be built. Continuity tends to make a person easier to work with, not because they are nicer, but because they are less reactive. They are not perpetually in crisis mode. They do not need the environment to be perfect for them to function. They can handle interruption without interpreting it as sabotage. They can stay steady enough to be predictable, and predictability is a form of trust. In most serious work, trust is the real currency. People will tolerate brilliance that burns them only for so long. They will build long projects with those who are steady. The mind's love of intensity also comes from its love of clean starts. Intensity is often triggered by a reset, a new week, a new plan, a new notebook, a new promise to oneself. The mind enjoys resets because resets offer identity renewal. They offer the feeling of being someone new without requiring the slow work of becoming someone new. Continuity does not offer that emotional refresh. It offers repetition, and repetition can feel dull to a mind that wants transformation through mood. But repetition is transformation, just not the theatrical kind. Repetition trains attention. It trains patience with the first rough minutes of beginning. It trains the ability to stay with a task as it deepens. It trains the ability to continue on days when the mind is not enthusiastic. Over time, these trained capacities become what people call discipline. But discipline in this sense is not force. It is continuity embodied. The most persuasive argument for continuity is not moral. It is empirical. People who rely on intensity often experience their working life as a series of cycles: sprint, crash, reset, sprint again. They live in the drama of their own effort. The drama can create stories that feel meaningful, but it also burns time. It produces gaps. It produces periods where the worker is not moving because they are recovering or because they are waiting for the next surge. When they look back, they may remember the highlights vividly, but the overall accumulation can be less than they expected. People who rely on continuity experience less drama and more build. They do not always remember specific days because the days are not theatrical. They remember that a project was completed, that a skill improved, that a relationship with work became steadier. They are less dependent on the feeling of being productive because their confidence is tied to repeated proof. Proof is quieter than inspiration, but it lasts longer. Continuity also changes the way setbacks feel. In an intensity-based pattern, a setback can feel catastrophic because it interrupts a fragile state. The worker was finally on a roll, finally inspired, finally sharp, and now something has broken the spell. The mind interprets the interruption as fate, as sabotage, as evidence that progress is always taken away. The emotional cost is disproportionate because the worker's sense of progress was tied to the existence of the burst. In a continuity-based pattern, a setback is simply an event in a longer chain. It may slow the chain, but it does not end it. The worker returns to the next piece because returning is the habit. Progress does not depend on a perfect streak, it depends on resuming contact. This makes resilience less dramatic. The person does not have to reinvent themselves after every disruption. They simply continue. The preference for continuity also clarifies what good work actually is. Good work is not always maximal output. Good work is the right amount of progress for the day that preserves the ability to return tomorrow. It is progress that does not require burnout as a payment. It is progress that does not turn the worker into someone who must be rebuilt after every push. Continuity respects the reality that life is not a single sprint. It is long. It is made of ordinary days. Work that cannot be performed on ordinary days is not reliable work, no matter how impressive it looks in bursts. This reframing also changes how one relates to ambition. Ambition often wants proof quickly. Continuity is patient without being passive. It does not lower standards. It lowers drama. It treats the path as something to walk rather than as something to conquer in a single charge. In doing so, it makes ambition more durable. It removes the need for constant emotional reinforcement. The worker stops needing to feel inspired in order to believe they are moving. They can trust the movement because movement is what is happening. When continuity is present, intensity becomes optional. It can appear at times, naturally, as a consequence of deep engagement or genuine urgency. It can be used without becoming dependency. The worker can sprint when sprinting is appropriate without designing their life around needing to sprint to feel alive. Intensity becomes a tool rather than a religion. The difference is that continuity creates a baseline. With a baseline, a person does not fear ordinary days. They do not treat low energy as failure. They do not interpret mild boredom as evidence that the work is wrong. They recognize that most meaningful effort is not emotionally spectacular. It is simply effort. It is attention placed on the task day after day until the task yields. That yielding is what people mistake as talent. Often it is continuity that made talent visible. In the end, continuity is not the absence of ambition. It is ambition made sane. It is progress without the addiction to peaks. It is the slow accumulation of unbroken contact, which is what turns intention into competence and competence into mastery. The mind may still crave intensity, still romanticize the dramatic night of output, still enjoy the feeling of being consumed by a project. Those feelings can exist. Continuity does not require their removal. It requires that the worker not confuse those feelings for the actual engine of progress. The engine is quieter. It is the return, the next small effort, the refusal to treat the day's emotional weather as the authority over whether the work gets done.